Now I have to consider how I'm going to be putting the components together and fitting them into my box. I decided previously that I'm going to be using proto board. Now I have two types of proto board here, and they're a little bit different in size, but they're very different in the layout. And I may have gone over this previously, but what I have here is two center rows that are spaced far enough apart to allow a dip package to fit on there, so I can hide my power rails underneath my IC. And with this, then my potentiometers would end up like so, and my terminal connector and my ammeter and my resistor, those aren't actually going to be sitting on the circuit board. What this is going to have my potentiometers, my resistors, my capacitors, my linear regulator, my integrated circuit, my diode, and then my MOSFET. So, it's quite a bit to fit on there, but, as long as it's all kind of, spaced out appropriately, it's not going to be an issue. But another thing that I have to consider is how I'm going to end up mounting my heatsink onto the MOSFET and get it into the case. And now is an appropriate time to actually pull out one of these heat sinks so we can start getting a gauge on the size of it. And the heat sink is actually part of the reason why I am continuing to do this with the Perma Proto board. And that's because in KiCad, there's not really a nice and handy way to put in a heat sink that I'm aware of. Can't really lay it out on your footprints for your board layout. So this is my heat sink. Take a look at that there. I've actually purchased 4 of these. So yeah, and what happens is the heat sink ends up sitting on the MOSFET like so, and it's got a couple of tabs on the side. I guess I could just take a pair of wire cutters and snip those off. What that's for is to give some structural support to the MOSFET, or to the heat sink, so it's not being supported by the MOSFET and the pins and the solder joints and not wiggling around. Kind of hard to, attach that here in a way that I can get the MOSFET onto it. MOSFET doesn't match any pins there. And these mounts are too large to, just fit through the holes on the breadboard. I could put it upside down, that'll work, but still, this heatsink is going to take up quite a chunk of real estate on my board. So it's probably going to end up having to, actually hang off the board. And that's a little, problematic right there. And let's see. Could I hook it up this way? If I trimmed a couple of them, just put it upside down. So, yeah, how I'm going to fit the heatsink on there is another concern. So that's why, this board here, which more closely resembles an actual breadboard has some advantages. Also allows me to space my potentiometers out a little more widely if I want to. The one drawback, though, of this, which may or may not be a drawback, I mean, considering how things are wired, it may not even matter, is the fact that every single pad on the board connects to a row or a column, a connective row or column. With this one, the pads on the very ends don't connect to anything. So that could be very useful for soldering longer pieces of wire, because I'm going to have some travel on this, because here's my, excuse me, I'm going to have some travel on my wires, because, you know, here's my box, you know, let's just place the fan in there for now. Well, my circuit board is going to be pretty small, and it's going to be bumped right up against that. So yeah, that's, you know, not leaving a whole lot of room. And then on top of that, I'm going to have to consider air circulation. I am relying on this fan moving air across the heat sink, which is really freaking tiny in comparison to some, you know, stuff that a lot of other people have done, to keep this MOSFET cool. Now, I can go ahead and just double up the MOSFET in there, and double up the heat sink. That does kind of, you know, complicate the wiring a bit. If I do that, yeah, I can just, you know, put the MOSFET, you know, boom, boom on the same channel, and, you know, put the heatsink, you know, in there. But, you know, it's a bit of a challenge to figure out how I'm going to, you know, put that on there. And then I'm going to also have to figure out the best way to, you know, have the air hitting this heatsink. Do I want to have the air, you know, hitting it from this big side, or do I want to have the air moving more across these fins? Do I, you know, possibly even want to, you know, set this down flat somehow in the airflow? And then I have to consider how or where the air is going to come from. I already know that the fan is going to be pushing air out of the case. So, you know, it's going to be blowing air out of the case, not into the case, out of the case. And that's something that you learn if you study computer science at all. So they do that because it's, you know, it offers improved cooling in the computers. Now, I have to consider then where I'm going to have my ventilation holes, because that's going to affect my airflow and how much air ends up getting pushed across my heat sink. So, you know, if my heat sink is in there, and then on top of that too, you know, I don't want to just have the heat sink and the board sitting there on the bottom of the case. I want to have it, you know, kind of up and off of there a little bit to get it more, you know, in line with the fan. So, yeah, that is, you know, definitely some items that I'm going to have to consider. One thing I may do just to, you know, save some space is possibly run some resistors or components, you know, some of my passive components on the underside of my proto board. Not really supposed to do that. All the components are supposed to go on the top side of the proto board. But if I'm wanting to kind of cram everything into as tight a space as possible, and then have it set up to where I can keep that heatsink properly cooled, you know, I might want to do that. Another big consideration, even on top of all of that, is this resistor. And, you know, I'll just take it off of here for now. So this resistor is going to have to go in there somewhere too. And it's also going to have to sit in the airflow. Now the resistor is not going to get as hot as the heat sink. But you know, if I have it like that, there's not really any airflow going over that resistor, or going over the heat sink. Probably won't end up like that, because in order to end up like that, I have to, you know, put my MOSFET on there and then bend this thing. And then, you know, make sure it's bent, and then I can screw that on there. Or I can see about having it, you know, like this somehow. Or I may even want to do them side by side like that. But then I'm going to have to decide how I'm going to mount these things. I need to have something I can attach both of those to and then still fit in my case. Now, because I do have these little lines in here, and these lines are, you know, perfectly spaced, you know, I could see possibly about getting a piece of Lexan or plexiglass or something like that, just to kind of, you know, make a, you know, a bit of a bridge on there, to mount my, you know, mount some things to. And then of course, the cutouts on this are going to be kind of a challenge. Just cutting some, you know, what I have is I have a Dremel tool. And that means I'm going to have to be cutting from, you know, the inside onto the outside. Getting a Dremel tool without a 90-degree attachment, getting a Dremel tool in here to cut in between these is going to be a major pain in the butt. The Dremel tool just simply, you know, doesn't work like that. What I do have, though, is I have a Dremel tool with the drill press attachment. I can rotate the Dremel tool and get the spin on that. So, you know, if I'm using like a cutting disc or sanding disc, it'll be vertical, kind of an alignment, and then adjust the height on it, and, you know, inch the box up to the cutting disc, and, you know, get in there, you know, get it on that way, maybe get it on that way. And yeah, so I mean, I've been thinking about, you know, maybe putting the ventilation on the sides, just cutting a, you know, series of slots in here. And then as far as mounting the, so yeah, I mean, my box would be kind of like that. And then I would end up having the that's going to be another challenge. Okay. Do it like that, maybe. There we go. That might be something that would work. That'd be kind of have to off to one side or the other. Make room for my IC. So yeah, at this point it's getting to where I can start thinking about how I'm going to dry fit my components together on my board, or on my PermaProto board, and thinking about how I'm going to get them mounted in my box. So yeah, hey, something more to think about there.